Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. We're leaving November for the chill of December and hoping that AppSec doesn't dim to an ember, that instead it burns brightly and begins to enshrine that good security comes by default and design, that the page count of hardening guides will start dwindling, and that all those top 10 lists are used for just kindling. Which means this week we chat with Adriana Villela about bringing observability to apps through OpenTelemetry. Warm your keyboards and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
This is episode 309, recorded December 2nd, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and we're diving right into a conversation with Adriana, who's a principal developer advocate based in Toronto, Canada. She helps companies achieve reliability greatness through observability, SRE, and DevOps practices. Previously, she managed a platform engineering team and an observability practices team at Tucows. Adriana has worked at various large-scale enterprises, both as an individual contributor and leader, including Bank of Montreal, Ceridian, and Accenture. Adriana is a maintainer of the OpenTelemetry end-user SIG, host of the Geeking Out podcast, a CNCF ambassador, and a HashiCorp ambassador. Hello, Adriana. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mike.
It's wonderful. I'm glad you're here taking time out of your own Geeking Out podcast. We'll ask about that maybe near the end, highlight that. Sure. But as I was perhaps stumbling over the word observability, this is going to be our theme of the day. And I do want to start off just asking, what makes observability more than just a lot of printf calls?
I mean, that is an excellent question. And yeah, I mean, we've all been there, right? With the printf calls, are you here? Please tell me you've gotten to this point. Yeah, observability is so much more because it's not meant to be reactive. It's meant to be proactive. It's the definition that I love the most actually comes from Hazel Weekly, which is the ability to ask meaningful questions and get useful answers. And I think that's really what observability gives us. And that's why I love it, because I think it takes us beyond, the what the hell is happening. It tells us what the hell is happening, or at least that's the goal.
That's the goal. And, as I read about OpenTelemetry and observability in general, there are also three terms that tend to come up, and kind of what you were describing, ways of answering questions, or maybe these are different sources of answers. You've got logging, metrics, and tracing. And these aren't the same. So we've got some nuances there too. So I wonder, is there a meaningful difference between these three terms that we should dive into, or can we just call it observability and continue on to something else?
I mean, there is definitely a meaningful difference. And I think all these things combined lead to having that, that big picture of what's going on in that system. So traces I see as like the backbone, the star of observability, because they give you that end-to-end picture. So, when you're on a website and you're buying like some shoes online and you hit add to cart, the trace will capture everything that happens from the time that you hit that button to when it adds that item to the cart. And then the logs can be thought of as, okay, what are the things that happen at particular points in time? So traces you can think of, and they're made up of spans. So spans they can represent like operations. So you have like the trace represents, adding thing to cart. And then the spans represent all the little things that happened, almost like function calls. They can represent function calls, but they can be a little bit more granular. And then the logs are basically, okay, what happened at a specific point in time? This is where we added the item to the cart. This is when we made the database call, et cetera, et cetera. And then the metrics give us they give us more information about our systems, right? Things like how long did it take to execute that particular trace? They give us, what was our CPU utilization like? What was our memory utilization like? How many shoes have we processed in the last hour today compared to the same time yesterday? So all these things combined together. They've been referred to in the past as the 3 pillars, and I don't like that because it implies like silos and that they shouldn't really talk to each other. But really it's about like these things aren't as useful unless you're correlating them, and all of them together tell that story. And so one of the things one of the founders of OpenTelemetry, Ted Young, he likes to describe them as braids of data because they're all intertwined and they work together to give you that big picture. So
I love that metaphor. And I love the idea here too, is what you're also describing questions, concerns that developers have about their systems, right? There's an aspect of, are we selling shoes? There's also the implied, is the cart working? Did we run out of inventory, or did we have some other bug that's stopping people at the checkout point? Our credit card, back end is down. These are areas that come up that hit, I'll call it the availability potentially part of that CIA triad with a security hat on. But it sounds like, there's a self-interest here, of course, for developers to add observability. But adding observability it's not easy, especially if a system has already been written. And I'm going to say it's sort of like, well, you have this code, make it secure, make it observable. A lot easier, that one sentence belies a lot of work.
Oh my God,
what does it take to convince, maybe they have the self-interest, but to figure out how do we add observability to our system?
So, I think you've really nailed it. Because when you've got an existing system and you're saying, let's make it observable, you're basically saying, let's add more technical debt to the system, right? Because we're adding more code, which freaks people out. It's like more work. And so there are a few things that you can do. You can't get away from the fact that eventually you're going to have to instrument your code. So instrumentation being like the process of adding, that information that you're sending out to make your code observable, right? And so there are a few things that you can do. So OpenTelemetry, which is is part of the CNCF, it's a vendor neutral framework that allows you to instrument your code. It has it has this concept called auto instrumentation or zero code instrumentation, where basically it's supported for certain languages. So like Java, Python, .NET, I want to say Node, Go. And for those, basically, there's like an agent or a shim that'll intercept your code at runtime or compile time, and it'll insert that telemetry for you. So you literally don't have to touch it. You just like use the wrapper, boom, magic happens. And that's a great way to get started, to start like getting insights into your telemetry. Into your application. Another way is, you have to kind of train your engineers to instrument as they code in the same way that, you're used to adding those printf statements, right? Get them used to adding that telemetry as they're writing new code. So at least like for the newer stuff, they don't have to worry about that. And then the other approach, like for existing code, a lot of times we have like existing frameworks, libraries, like homegrown ones. So let's start with instrumenting those, because chances are the code's going to be touching a lot of those libraries and frameworks. So then that helps. And then finally, I guess the final incentive is like, if your house is constantly on fire, you stop building the friggin' bedroom and just start investing in instrumenting your code, because I think at that point you really have no choice. Because do you want to be sitting like, on Black Friday, dying because you don't know what the hell is going on, why your system's performing badly or why your orders aren't going through? That would suck.
Yeah, we're recording this on the Cyber Monday, so very topical.
That's right.
There's code freezes, code chills. There's don't touch anything because who knows what might happen. Part of that too is, talking about that instrumentation, dropping those printfs everywhere. That was my very naive approach to observability. How do you know how do you know when you have too much observability? Because on the one hand, we can say, well, let's just instrument, every 10 lines of code or every function. I think you can have too much observability, but I don't necessarily know what that looks like. Help us think through, overdoing this.
Yeah, that's a super fair question because like there is such thing as information overload, and then you're like, I don't know what to do. And we had that like when at my time when I was managing an observability team at Two Cows, and I was focused on observability practices and making sure that the engineers at Two Cows were instrumenting their code properly and whatnot. And so getting them into the habit of just instrumenting, like doing the right things, that was extremely hard. So one of the things that one of the main complaints that they came to us with was like, I don't know what to look for. And that's super fair. So
Fair.
I think, first of all, I think you go into this like, and especially as I mentioned, like if you're doing auto instrumentation, one of the side effects is that it might send too much data and it's not data that you necessarily need. And I think it's one of those things like instrument first, and then you're going to kind of cull it a little bit. You're going to pare it down. But you don't know what's too much until you see it. So with auto instrumentation, you can like switch off, like basically with auto instrumentation, a lot of the popular libraries that we use, like Python Flask, for example, and Python requests, those are auto instrumented. And, it might be you turn on the auto instrumentation, you're like, too much stuff. So you can like switch off like certain libraries from auto instrumentation. The other thing that I think is useful, and I think this is where QA can come into play quite nicely, because, the instrumenting your code doesn't just benefit developers, doesn't just benefit your SREs, it can also benefit your QAs, right? Because especially if they're doing like, what's the type of testing? Not spot testing, it is exploratory testing that I'm thinking of. Where they're doing exploratory testing and just messing around with the system, and they can use the instrumented data to basically troubleshoot. And if they are having trouble, so the beauty of it is they can go back to the developer and say, hey, I found a bug and this is where it is, right? Because they had the code instrumented and they can provide that guidance. Or they can go back to the developer and say, found a bug, I can't figure out what's going on. So either the code's been under-instrumented or over-instrumented. So then that can give an inkling to the developer, hey, I need to refine this. But it is going to be I think it starts out as trial and error to a certain extent initially. And I think it's going to be one of those things that, I think developers getting the habit of debugging their code, using their own observability data, and QAs getting in the habit of leveraging the observability data, I think those things can really complement each other quite nicely.
And then I assume OpenTelemetry can help with this too, because part of that iteration could be either we're not going to emit as much events as possible, or on the back end, we're just going to filter out or avoid, looking at some. So tell us a little bit about how OpenTelemetry can work on either side of that equation, perhaps, so that, that QA example sounded really good. You might want to turn up observability in this location, but turn it down when it goes back out to prod.
Yeah, so there are a couple of approaches. So OpenTelemetry has this component called the collector, and it's basically like this vendor-neutral agent where you send your telemetry data to the collector, and then the collector can basically it's like a data pipeline. So it'll ingest, transform, and then export the data, and it exports the data to one or more observability backends. So you can even use it like you're considering like more than one vendor, hey, you can export the same data to multiple vendors and you can see what the data looked like, in 3 different vendors at the same time. And one of the things as part of like the collector's processing capabilities is it has the ability to like sample your data. So basically you can specify like how you want to sample your data. So it basically will restrict the flow of the data based on like a number of sampling rules. So that's one way to approach it, which is pretty cool. The other way is you can combine it with like feature flagging tools. So for example, like maybe you have like a restricted number of telemetry data that you're sending out, but then you're noticing, things are not going so well in prod. Maybe, use the feature flagging tool to basically up the level of your telemetry that you're exporting. So then in that case, and that's kind of important too, because obviously, like if you're sending a lot of data, especially to a SaaS vendor, that is going to cost you money. and that's something that a lot of people are running into as well, is that they're starting to see, oh, this is great, I'm sending all this data out, but oh my God, it's costing me a fortune. How can I ensure that this doesn't break the bank?
Yeah, and that's got to be one of those, hidden gotchas too. When I say, too much observability could be, well, we have actually sufficient observability, but it's too much cost. And it sounds like sampling, as you mentioned, is one of those really good solutions for that. Are there other ways to be either smart about how much you're logging, how you're handling those logs, or how much information you're generating? So I'm trying to remember what the phrase you said, but it was equivalent to information overload. How we just have enough that becomes useful to answer the questions, rather than having sort of an analysis paralysis when we've got just too many things to look at. I'm not sure what to decide on.
Yeah, I mean, the other approach that you can take is just like instrument a little bit at a time as well, and just kind of see. So it's like, your faucet's dripping, rather than just like release the hounds and like gush of water. And you're like, just do a little bit at a time and let's see. Because that could be another thing that some folks might find useful, especially if, they don't want to be faced with the data overwhelm, right?
No, and part of this too is, you have a developer background. We're talking about observability. And I highlight this because, we're ostensibly an application security weekly podcast, but observability clearly is very core to security. Knowing what's going on, asking those questions. A lot of times security might be reactive questions like, oh, what just happened? Or how many records were breached because of this? Or how many people found and exercised this one vuln? Observability can hopefully, fingers crossed here, answer a lot of those questions. So that's got to be, positive angle. Has that come up in your, pitching this to developers, or talking about, their self-interest, that type of, how much does security appear in these conversations?
Not that much, to be honest. And I think it has to be. I think it's interesting because I remember from my developer days, like, security felt like a 4-letter word. It's like, oh my God, we have to like do the, meet the InfoSec requirements, make sure that our systems are like meet the security checks and all that. And, it made me think of how like observability and security have that in common, in that it's one of those things that we absolutely need to shift left on. We're not necessarily shifting left on these things as much as we ought to. And I do wonder if we had like, observability in the context of security, that would make a much more compelling argument, I think, for developers, that like, hey, this can help to point out when things are not as secure as they ought to be. And especially in cases where like, I have no freaking clue to where to start looking for this, right? And I feel like, as you said, it can start pointing to where the problem might be, which is
and I think for me, especially what comes to mind for me are things like bug bounties. A lot of applications have bug bounties. People are going to find bugs in software. That just happens. This is a code quality. We have observability because, as you're describing, QA, bugs go out as much as we try to avoid them. Some of those bugs just have that security consequences to them. And what I like to point out is, like, if you have a bug bounty, here's a report that comes in. Did you have, call it observability? Were you able to identify the activity from that researcher? Could you reproduce it in your logs? Did you identify that this researcher was working on this on a Monday morning, but nobody else has been looking at that for the last month or the last year or throughout your logs? So that's kind of how I would pitch that idea of observability, just being able to give us better ways of saying, no, that didn't happen, because trying to disprove something can be fraught with danger. That could be really, really difficult.
Yeah, so true. And it makes me think too, like, I've been in situations where systems acting slow. So it's like, oh, let's talk to the database
Network is
people.
slow.
No, nothing here. Oh, let's talk to like the network people. No, nothing here. Let's talk to the app server people. No, nothing here. And it's like, okay, it's slow somewhere. Something's gotta give. And so it's similar, like, okay, observability will point you to the evidence, like, no, it really was the database or whatever, right? And you can't hide behind the, well, it looks okay here.
Well, and actually that does bring me back to just the pure observability aspect. How do we, one thing with incident response, for example, just with any logging is just make sure your timestamps are uniform and your time is synchronized amongst everything so that those traces actually do line up. With observability, you can have a classic, you have your front end, maybe you have your middleware server and your backend database, or you have a microservice architecture. There's a lot of different services talking to each other. Some of them are instrumented, some of them aren't. What are some of these ways, I guess maybe let's go back to that land of gotchas, or what are some of the ways to make sure that you have observability that can figure out this request was slow. How do we point that finger, or how do we know that we would be able to at least equip to answer that question in like a microservice or amongst a huge group of systems and teams?
I think in those cases, and especially like, given that we're like in the midst of Cyber Monday and whatnot, like service level objectives can really help with that. They can, you basically specify, okay, I need to have this kind of response time 98% of the time for my services for service X. And if that's not happening, it's going to fire off an alert. Now, usually that's tied to like your service level objective is ultimately tied down to a metric. And if all your signals are correlated, all of your telemetry is correlated, that metric is ultimately tied down to a trace and hopefully a log as well. And so you can be like, oh, I can, follow those breadcrumbs to figure out from this alert, hey, this pinpoints where that problem was. And so that can be really helpful. The trick with service level objectives is it's you have to start somewhere. You're not going to get it perfect the first time, but as you get better at understanding your system, you can further refine and then they become more and more useful to you. So that's the caveat. That's the trick with them. They're not easy, but I think once you get them to a good point, they can really be helpful for you.
Yeah, I think that's where we'll come to geeking out in a little bit, but that's where also I think SREs like to geek out. They love measuring things like is this uptime? How long has this been going? Are there? I know it's going to be hard to answer this question I'm about to ask, but I'm going to try anyway. Are there common metrics that you find SREs or working with OpenTelemetry are useful to monitor for? And I say that with the caveat that a lot of apps can have bespoke setups. The SLOs maybe customization is probably more important. But I'm curious if there's at least a starting point to help people when they're looking at that blank page about figuring out how to use this OpenTelemetry.
Yeah, I think mostly it's stuff around like your response time on certain services. That really becomes the thing that a lot of people will turn to. And so knowing, and if I recall correctly, it's been a while since I've talked about SLOs, but you want it to be tied more to the user interaction and less to like, the deep down back end stuff. So that I think that's the main thing where people can get stuck on creating SLOs.
That's a great point because that's subjective. That the network is slow. That's what the end user is going to say. That's what they're going to complain about, right? And speaking of end users, you're part of the the OpenTelemetry end user SIG. That's pretty interesting. Tell us a little bit about that. Like, how is this? Either people could participate, give feedback. What does that look like? Is that type of end user focus?
Yeah. So the OTel end user SIG is basically it fosters a sense of community within OpenTelemetry where we connect end users to each other, but we also connect end user feedback to the various other SIGs within OpenTelemetry. So we do a few things to help that happen. So one of the things we do is we have this thing called OTel Q&A, where we basically interview our end users to figure out how they use OpenTelemetry in their respective organizations, which, I think it becomes super important to see how different organizations use OpenTelemetry. So you can be like, oh, that's a cool idea, or hadn't thought of that. Or just to bring confidence, especially when OpenTelemetry was new and people were like, this thing, like, is it really here to stay? So I think it helps bring a sense of confidence and can alert people or inform people to like different ways that they're using OpenTelemetry or even deploying like the OpenTelemetry collector within their infrastructure. The other thing that we have is called OTel in Practice, where again, our practitioners come and it's a meetup style sort of gathering where you can present on an OpenTelemetry topic. Cool thing that you've figured out how to do in your org, awesome. Or want to test out an OpenTelemetry or observability related talk that you're going to give or planning on giving at some point. Guinea pig with us. It's fine. We're happy to have you. And then the other aspect is, like I said, bringing that end user feedback. And so we've partnered with a number of the OTel SIGs by basically administering surveys on their behalf. So, for example, the OpenTelemetry collector folks reached out to us earlier in the year and said, hey, like we want to hear from users to help drive the roadmap for the collector. We want to know what's important to them. So we worked with them on a survey that we distributed and socialized. And then we shared the results with them. We shared the results with the OTel maintainers. And then we also had a live panel with a select group of end users to hear live feedback from the end users, connected them directly with the collector maintainers. So now we have I would say a concrete path for delivering that feedback back to the SIGs, which is, I think, always a challenge, right? It's like everyone has opinions. How do you ensure that they're heard? And the other thing too, and I think this is something that we see with a lot of open source projects, it's very easy to criticize. It's like, oh, this documentation's crap. Yeah, okay, it is crap. But as a user, then what can you do to contribute and not make it crap? So, we want to encourage, rather than that, fatalistic view of open source, it's not all it's cracked up to be. No, well, help us solve it and make it more awesome.
Yeah, and especially as you're highlighting, OpenTelemetry is here to stay. It's not. I think it's 2 decades old, but it's very worn out about open sources. You get what you pay for. That's just like a kind of a dead cliche anymore these days. And everything you were describing sounds like very much what application security or security in general could do in the sense of guardrails. We as the industry talk about create guardrails, security guardrails. But what if we also had end user SIGs to ask about, are these guardrails working? How are these guardrails? Have you gotten around them for some reason in a clever way because you needed to do something, or are they failing you? So there's I think, a lot of things that I'm more of soapboxing at the moment to our audience of security folks here about taking these types of development engagement experiences. Let me also ask you, Adriana, one other thing about practicing these presentations. Have you ever gotten anybody from a security team coming and talking about their use of OpenTelemetry or observability?
We haven't, but if anyone's listening,
opportunity.
I invite you to please come talk to us, because I think that'd be really cool. The other thing I wanted to mention that you got me thinking, as I mentioned, the OpenTelemetry collector, it's this vendor neutral agent for getting data ingested and then exported to an observability vendor. And security is very important and top of mind when it comes to the collector, because, for example, there have been a few times in the recent past where CVEs have been identified. And so we all rally together in the OpenTelemetry community and say, hey, the latest version of the collector addresses these CVEs, please upgrade. And that's a reason to stay up to date with your version of OpenTelemetry and of the collector, is making sure that you're not accidentally introducing vulnerabilities into your system that you shouldn't be, right?
Yes, yes. Especially when it's something that you can call it layer on or add this shim, shouldn't be increasing your attack surface. That's always the oops, oh, we didn't want to do that. And maybe if I can ask real quick, there's a little bit of history of OpenTelemetry. It came out of OpenCensus, I believe, as well. And there was also like part of there were security problems in the past too. And becomes like, how much do we deal with security? How much can we... Basically, maybe tell us a little bit about, if you have good top of mind, about what it's like to deal with those security issues that come up for a project like this.
To be honest, I don't have any experience on that, so I'm probably not the best person to ask.
No problem. But what I think you're the best person to ask about is geeking out. So as you've taken time out of your podcast to come hang out with us, what was the last thing you geeked out on? Give our listeners an idea of what they can check out with yours.
Oh, so we actually have, so today's December 2nd. Tomorrow, December 3rd, I'm releasing the latest episode. I took a little break in October, but we're back till the end of till like mid-December. And the latest episode that's coming out is I am geeking out with Ixchel Ruiz, and she is a Java developer. So we are geeking out on Java. And I love the conversation with her because she comes from a development background. She did the developer advocacy thing for a while, but then she decided, no, I actually love being a part of a project and being, I love the deadlines, and I can still do the advocacy stuff, built into my job without being formally having that formal developer advocate role. So she gives some like really cool tips on just getting into like giving talks, getting into conferences, from the perspective of a developer, but who has that advocacy experience and who is, oddly enough, I think a lot of us developer advocates are shy folks. So putting yourself out there, she was talking about unconferences, which they're kind of cool. I hadn't really considered them, but they're cool because like they don't necessarily have like any set topics or proposals that you're submitting. It's just like you come together and you agree on, hey, you suggest some topics and then you can talk ad hoc on some stuff. And it's a great way to like talk about something you're passionate about without the pressure of a prepared talk, which is very cool. And it was interesting too, because I come from a Java development background. I haven't done it for a while, but I did do like 16 years of Java early on in my career. And Ixchel is still like very dialed into the Java community. And she spewed out so many like different Java conferences that you can attend. I'm like, oh my God, wow. It is still alive and thriving, the Java community, which has been very cool.
A language that is not going away. And
No.
I think I'm going to have to put, I love the deadlines is going to go on to a potential t-shirt slogan for me. So I love that attitude. But sadly, speaking of deadlines, Adriana, we've run up to the end of our segment. So I want to say thank you once again and see, is there anything else you'd like to call out for people to pay attention to in addition to your podcast? Anything that else you're working on, or that people, if they're interested in OpenTelemetry, could learn more about?
So I would suggest anyone who's interested in contributing to OpenTelemetry, start with the docs, especially if you're coming at it from fresh eyes. That's the kind of thing that we love to see. It's an opportunity to contribute with, it's a pretty low barrier to entry. Also want to mention, I've got a tech blog on Medium. It's adri-v.medium.com. And I talk about mostly OpenTelemetry, but also some platform engineering topics. I've been dabbling in dev containers for the last little while. It was a use case around OpenTelemetry, but it's kind of turned into like a little obsession around other things as well. So that's been kind of fun. So anyway, I dig deep into the tech. I am a believer in like explaining all the little details. So because I hate it when I have to do an archaeological dig to try to understand a tech article. So my style is like really getting into the nitty gritty. So
sounds like absolutely what a blog is designed to do. We'll throw that link into the show notes for everyone to go check out. Thanks so much, Adriana.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.